Ladies and gentlemen, it's not that I've ever needed a microphone in my life, but thank you very much. It is a joy and an honor, a privilege for me to be here today on this panel with our two amazing panelists, Thomas Williams and Jacqueline Rivers. I'm going to give you a brief introduction of both of them. I'd like you to pay attention to the introductions just so that you understand. For those of you that are unfamiliar with their work, if you are, for whatever reason, unfamiliar with their work, you should be familiar with both of them. So they're amazingly accomplished. So I'm going to take a few minutes, read their brief bios to show you how amazing the talks are that you're about to hear. So Thomas Williams teaches theology at St. John's University, the Rome campus, having previously held the chair in Catholic social thought at Rome's Regina Apostolorum Pontifical Athenaeum for 10 years. He has worked as a consultant and commentator on faith, ethics, and religion for several television networks, including NBC, CBS, Sky News, Newsmax, and numerous others. He was appointed by the Holy See as a spokesman for the Synod of Bishops in 1997, and then again in 2001. Thomas has written widely on theology, philosophy, ethics, spirituality, and including 19 books. So if you're ever feeling a little self-conscious about your productivity, do not talk to Thomas Williams.
We're having trouble sleeping.
His 19 books include Who is My Neighbor?, Personalism and the Foundations of Human Rights, The World as It Could Be, Catholic Social Thought for a New Generation. He is also one of his most endearing qualities. He is, besides his lovely wife, whom you'll have the pleasure of hearing speak later, he is a certified wine sommelier, general bon vivant, a wonderful friend and companion, and he, in fact, made his own professional acting debut in 2019 with a part in the Netflix original, The Two Popes. Dr. Rivers is the executive director of the Seymour Institute for Black Church and Policy Studies. She served as a lecturer in sociology at Harvard University and has presented at the Vatican and numerous other venues, countless other venues, I think is probably a better way to say it. She was a senior fellow at the King's College in New York City and a fellow in the W.E.B. Du Bois Research Institute at Harvard University. Among her publications is a chapter in Not Just Good, But Beautiful, a volume co-authored with Pope Francis and others. She serves on the Board of Advisors for the Religious Freedom Institute, the Board of Directors of Becket Law, and the Center for Early African Christianity, and on the Religious Liberty Initiative Board of Advisors at the University of Notre Dame. She holds a PhD, a master's in sociology, and a master's in psychology from Harvard University, and graduated from Harvard College summa cum laude, just so that you have the bona fides of our two amazing presenters. We're going to have a conversation today about the living tradition, specifically in the papacy and in the person of Pope Leo, and in the challenges of the post-Francis Church. It's what Thomas is going to talk to us about. Jackie will speak on two Pope Leos, the Black Church and Catholic social teaching. So Thomas, to you, the microphone.
Well, I am delighted to be sharing this platform with two such esteemed and also dear colleagues and friends of mine. And I'm especially looking forward to Jackie's words that will follow mine. I initially was intending something a little more academic and a little more of an analysis, colder analysis of the Leonine pontificate these first months. But as I started writing this, it became more and more something of a travel log. So this is going to be unusually personal and candid rather than academic. I hope that doesn't bother you too much. It might open up for interesting discussion after. And I've broken into, these are very short, so don't be afraid when I list several little titles. The papal election, the first 100 days, Leo's who am I to judge moment, meeting the Pope, the hubbub over Dilexite, and living tradition, are the way it's kind of going to be broken up. But again, it will be very personal and straightforward. I am going to start by saying something which may be taken for granted. I love the Catholic Church. I love the institution of the papacy. I am very grateful for it, and I see it as a singular gift that guarantees the unity of the Church and confirms generations of Catholics in the faith. For me personally, the 12 years preceding last May's conclave were something of a trial. Living as I do less than a half mile from the Vatican, I was privy not only to first-person accounts of the doings of the Francis pontificate, but also the reigning atmosphere of certain malaise and fear around the Holy See that seemed to characterize this period, which happily was invisible, I think, to the rest of the world. But worst of all, from my perspective, was the doctrinal confusion and ambiguity that dogged almost every dimension of those years. And having studied the history of the church, I was obviously aware that truly great pontificates are something of a rarity. And I had no doubt become somewhat spoiled living in an era of exceptional pontiffs. Yet this latest conclave seemed particularly weighty and important to me. And for me, the story started last April when I was approached by a large American television news channel to cover the funeral of Pope Francis and the conclave to elect his successor, something I'd previously done for other news agencies for the death of Pope John Paul II and the election of Pope Benedict. And as such, for the next 2 weeks, I would have a daily bird's eye view of the happenings in the Vatican from a rooftop overlooking St. Peter's Square. In our daily considerations of the members of the College of Cardinals and in efforts to identify the most likely papabili, on and off air we discuss the qualities needed for a pope at this moment in history and the different concerns the cardinal electors would have. In the period leading up to the conclave, those days really, a couple weeks, I began to get the distinct sense that Cardinal Robert Prevost was being groomed as something of a stealth candidate for those who were looking for a pontificate in close continuity with that of Pope Francis. Similar to the way that Cardinal Bergoglio had been put forward in 2013. It seemed increasingly clear that the ostensible frontrunners, such as Cardinal Pietro Parolin, Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, Cardinal Matteo Zuppi, and Cardinal Pier Battista Pizzaballa, actually had little chance of garnering the necessary votes to win, and it would be something of a dark horse who would eventually wear the fisherman's ring. As my worries grew, I reached out to a well-known American Catholic intellectual friend, who will necessarily remain nameless, to share my thoughts, and he echoed the concerns, promising to share them with cardinals with whom he was close. He also suggested, from his perspective, that those who seemed to be pushing for a Prevost candidacy were wholly unlikely to have the church's best interests at heart, at least as we understood them. I also called my good friend, journalist Ed Penton, when I realized that his very helpful website, the College of Cardinals report, did not even have Robert Prevost listed among the papabili, and scarcely said anything about him at all. The very next day, Ed added him to the papabile page, but still with insufficient material regarding his positions on key matters, which were largely unknown. When May 8th rolled around, the second day of the conclave, I was on air sitting on a stool next to our host just past 6 p.m. when white smoke started billowing out of the Sistine Chapel chimney. The short conclave, concluded in just 4 ballots, offered a general sense of hope, since it signified unity and rapid coalescence around a single candidate, which is always a good sign. A longer deliberation would have suggested disunity and greater division among the cardinal electors. At 7:12 p.m. that evening, that Thursday, the Cardinal Protodeacon Dominique Mamberti emerged onto the papal balcony and began the announcement according to the established formula. Annuncio vobis gaudium magnum, habemus papam eminentissimum ac reverendissimum Dominum Robertum Franciscum. And on hearing the name Robertum, my stomach fell. I leaned over and whispered to the host of the show, "It's Prevost," since there was no way that Cardinal Robert Sarah had been elected that quickly. And Mamberti continued, "Sancte Romane Ecclesia Cardinalem Prevost, qui sibi nomen imposuit Leonem XIV, Leo XIV. Not long after, Leo himself emerged and greeted the crowds from the balcony of the papal apartments. From there, he delivered his first Urbi et Orbi address and blessing. To anxious observers, every detail seemed significant. The return to the traditional red mozzetta, which Francis had put aside, his choice of name, his invocation of a synodal church, his Christ-centeredness, his use of Spanish without a word of English. When the blessing concluded, I happened to run into a friend from EWTN who was frankly overwrought. I simply cannot handle another 12 years like we had under Francis, he said. I too was concerned, but over the coming days, my opinion softened. As Catholics, we want to love the Pope, and I was anxious to find reasons to love him and to trust him. He spoke of continuity with Pope Francis, but in the context of continuity with his immediate predecessors as well. He prayed in Latin in his first meeting with the College of Cardinals, during which he asked them for their assistance in the mission of governing the Church, moving away from the perceived autocratic manners of the Francis pontificate. He announced he would be moving back into the papal apartments. He returned to the papal residence at Castel Gandolfo during the summer. It also seemed interesting that despite Pope Francis's frequent reproaches of rigid doctors of the law, the cardinals had elected a man with a doctorate in canon law to replace him. As one priest wrote not long after, such stylistic departures, while not decisive, are still significant. They suggest that unlike Francis's penchant to bend the office to his person, Leo appears bent on accommodating his person to the office he has assumed. The name itself of Leo suggested a desire to reach back and reconnect with the great tradition of Catholic social thought, with its concern for the plight of workers, a wariness toward socialism, and a vigorous defense of the natural right to private property. And in his address on May 10th to the College of Cardinals, Leo said, "Sensing myself called to continue in this same path, I chose to take the name Leo XIV. There are different reasons for this, but mainly because Leo XIII, in his encyclical Rerum Novarum, addressed this social question in the context of the first great industrial revolution. In our own day, the Church offers to everyone the treasury of her social teaching in response to another industrial revolution, and to developments in the field of artificial intelligence that pose new challenges for the defense of human dignity, justice, and labor." Over and over again during the first weeks and months of his pontificate, Leo put himself forward as a pope of unity, encapsulated in his beautiful motto, in illo uno unum, in the one Christ we are one. And one could almost see a sort of reunification taking place in the Church that had become nearly as polarized as our political society. Pope Leo XIV, the first American to ascend to the papacy, was warmly embraced by Catholics of every stripe and political inclination, a remarkable feat, especially in our increasingly divided age. Everyone found things to like about Leo, and people who differ widely in their social and political leanings found reasons to believe that the cardinals had elected a winner. In mid-August, I was contacted by the same television news network to analyze the first 100 days of Leo's pontificate. I began by noting the stark differences between a political leader's first 100 days and that of the Pope. Presidents often try to make their mark on the office quickly, often with a flurry of executive orders, knowing that they often have just a couple years during which to truly govern. A pope, on the other hand, especially a relatively young one like Leo, could easily have 20 or even 30 years at the helm of the bark of Peter. And there's no rush for them to make hasty changes or to try to leave a personal imprint on this millennial institution. At the time, Pope Leo was off at Castel Gandolfo. We're talking about August of this year. And Rome was relatively quiet despite ongoing Jubilee celebrations. This was, I reflected, one of the marks of the Leonine pontificate that I appreciated most, the serenity and peace that seemed to characterize Leo's first 100 days. There were, notably, no off-the-cuff statements to reporters, no strange pronouncements requiring prolonged deciphering and spinning by the director of the Holy See press office. While some more traditionally minded Catholics expressed their grievances that Leo was moving too slow to clean house in reference to matters such as his decision to leave the manifestly unfit Cardinal Victor Tuccio Fernandez in his post as prefect of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, or his unwillingness to roll back the strict limitations imposed by Francis on the traditional Latin Mass. His measured approach seemed to me to be exactly what the Church needed at the moment. I thought that this is perhaps the genius of the Leonine style, incarnating those words of Isaiah later attributed to Jesus. A bruised reed he will not break, a smoldering wick he will not quench until he brings justice to victory. It seemed that Leo wished to integrate or reintegrate all Catholics, and that meant progressives as well as conservatives, into the fold. And he clearly did not wish to pit himself against his predecessor by directly contradicting his initiatives. 2 weeks later, Leo had what some have called his "who am I to judge" moment, at which point I was very tempted to throw out all the notes I had begun composing for my talk and simply start all over again. Very early in his pontificate, during an extraordinary 82-minute exchange with reporters aboard the papal plane returning from his first trip to celebrate World Youth Day in Brazil, Pope Francis was asked what he intended to do regarding reports of the allegedly open homosexual activity of Monsignor Battista Ricca, who had been appointed by Francis just the prior month as interim prelate of the Vatican Bank, as well as Monsignor Ricca's purported ties to a gay lobby within the Vatican itself. The Pope suggested that any indiscretions of Monsignor Ricca were a thing of the past. Quote, "If a person, whether it be a lay person, a priest, or a religious sister, commits a sin and then converts, the Lord forgives. And when the Lord forgives, the Lord forgets. And this is very important for our lives," the Pope said, putting forward the example of St. Peter and his denials of Christ. He then went on to utter the line that came to define his pontificate in the eyes of some. Quote, "If someone is gay and he searches for the Lord and has goodwill, who am I to judge?" This quip, which seemed to downplay the importance of the church's moral teaching, for some at least, led to a flurry of glowing news reports suggesting that the church finally had a pope who put mercy and inclusiveness ahead of doctrinal rigor and discipline. Now fast forward to the present. On September 16th, the Archbishop of Chicago, Cardinal Blaise Cupich, announced that the Archdiocesan Office of Human Dignity and Solidarity would bestow on Illinois Senator Dick Durbin a Lifetime Achievement Award for his efforts on behalf of migrants at the Keep Hope Alive benefit on November 3rd. The announcement generated fierce public backlash from pro-life advocates as well as no fewer than 10 U.S. bishops who decried the decision as a grave scandal and a betrayal of Catholic teachings on the defense of human life. In particular, Bishop Thomas Paprocki of Springfield, Illinois, in whose diocese Durbin resides and who had forbidden Durbin from receiving Holy Communion because of his full-bore support for abortion on demand, said he was shocked by the announcement. Quote, "Given Senator Durbin's long and consistent record of supporting legal abortion, including opposing legislation to protect children who survive failed abortions, this decision risks causing grave scandal, confusing the faithful about the church's unequivocal teaching on the sanctity of human life," he wrote in an article published September 20th. 10 days later, on September 30th, Valentina Donato, a reporter from EWTN News, approached Pope Leo outside Castel Gandolfo to ask about the award, noting that, quote, "Some people of faith are having a hard time with understanding this because he is pro, or rather he is for, legalized abortion. How would you help people of faith right now decipher that, feel about that, and how do you feel about that?" End quote. And the Pope replied, "I'm not terribly familiar with that particular case. I think it's important to look at the overall work that a senator has done during, if I'm not mistaken, 40 years of service in the United States Senate. I understand the difficulty and the tensions, but I think, as I myself have spoken in the past, it's important to look at many issues that are related to what is the teaching of the church. Someone who says I'm against abortion but says I'm in favor of the death penalty is not really pro-life," the Pope continued. "Someone who says that I'm against abortion but I'm in agreement with the inhuman treatment of immigrants who are in the United States, I don't know if that's pro-life," end quote. Taken at face value, this theologically unfortunate statement would mean that St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, and the newest doctor of the church, St. John Henry Newman, were not pro-life, and that's a very tough sell. It's also difficult to reconcile with the clarification made by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger to the U.S. bishops on the same question in 2004, when he was prefect of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. There's no point in citing the entire carefully crafted text here, but in it, Ratzinger stated, "Not all moral issues have the same moral weight as abortion and euthanasia. For example, if a Catholic were to be at odds with the Holy Father on the application of capital punishment or on the decision to wage war, he would not for that reason be considered unworthy to present himself to receive Holy Communion. While the Church exhorts civil authorities to seek peace, not war, and to exercise discretion and mercy in imposing punishment on criminals, it may still be permissible to take up arms to repel an aggressor or to have recourse to capital punishment. There may be a legitimate diversity of opinion, even among Catholics, about waging war and applying the death penalty, but not, however, with regard to abortion and euthanasia, end quote. Theories abound regarding the context and circumstances surrounding the Pope's words, with some insisting he was blindsided by the reporter and others that he had been undermined by Cardinal Cupich. It's perhaps worth noting that from that moment on, Leo has avoided taking spontaneous questions from journalists. And on October 15th, Leo named Cardinal Cupich to the Pontifical Commission for the Vatican City-State, a primarily administrative role. Last month, my wife Liz and I had the privilege of finally meeting Pope Leo face-to-face, and though this encounter did nothing to modify my opinion of the Pope one way or the other, it did provide me with an opportunity to thank him for his efforts to reunify the Church, a task that is sorely needed, and thanks that were incredibly sincere. In person, he comes across as one would expect: serene, gentle, attentive, thoughtful. 2 more weeks go by, and October 9th, the Vatican released Pope Leo's first teaching letter, an apostolic exhortation bearing the Latin title Dilexite, or I have loved you, a citation from the book of Revelation. Pope Francis had composed a draft of the letter, which Leo inherited and modified, making it his own to a certain extent. Early reactions to the letter were predictably divided, with some conservatives insisting that Leo had adopted an approach to economic ethics more in line with Pope Francis and Pope Paul VI than with Pope Leo XIII or with Pope John Paul II. As one thoughtful writer put it, Dilexite is thus squarely in the long tradition of Christian redistributionist thinking about poverty, rather than in the tradition of Leo XIII or John Paul II, according to whom the plight of workers is to be relieved primarily by expanding the scope of their economic liberty, their agency, and their creativity, and is, quote, rooted in a view that man's greatest resource is himself. Nonetheless, for all the hand-wringing of some, the text itself, at least in my mind, is thoroughly Catholic and ultimately uplifting and inspiring, providing helpful nuance in an ongoing discussion that should interest all Christians. Eschewing a purely economic or sociological understanding of poverty, for instance, Leo writes, "The condition of the poor is a cry that throughout human history constantly challenges our lives, societies, political and economic systems, and not least the Church. On the wounded faces of the poor, we see the suffering of the innocent and therefore the suffering of Christ himself. At the same time, we should perhaps speak more correctly of the many faces of the poor and of poverty, since it's a multifaceted phenomenon. In fact, there are many forms of poverty: the poverty of those who lack material means of subsistence, the poverty of those who are socially marginalized and lack the means to give voice to their dignity and abilities, moral and spiritual poverty, cultural poverty, the poverty of those who find themselves in a condition of personal or social weakness or fragility, the poverty of those who have no rights, no space, no freedom." The text also underscores the poverty of humanity itself, suggesting that Christ has indeed come to bring the good news to the poor, but this is a category that includes all who are willing to embrace their own neediness and their own radical insufficiency. Thus understood, poverty does not divide humanity into conflicting classes, but unites humanity before God, who looks with loving mercy upon our common poverty. This conference is devoted to the idea of living tradition. The idea of traditio, or the passing on or handing on, is particularly important when it comes to the office of the Roman pontiff. As successor of St. Peter, Leo's task is first and foremost to confirm his brethren in the faith and pass on in its integrity the Depositum Fidei. On September 12th, the Italian Catholic daily L'Avvenire published an interview with Ghanaian Cardinal Robert Sarah, in which he said he looks to Pope Leo XIV with great confidence, adopting, curiously, the very words of our conference here, and I would like to end my remarks by citing him. Leo XIV is bringing to the fore the indispensable centrality of Christ, the evangelical awareness that without him we can do nothing, neither build peace, nor build the church, nor save our souls. Furthermore, he seems to me to have an intelligent attention to the world, in a spirit of listening and dialogue, always with a thoughtful consideration of tradition. Tradition is like a driving force of history, both of history in general and that of the church. Without a living tradition that allows the transmission of divine revelation, the church itself could not exist. We need, he wrote, to overcome an ideological approach that has promoted two competing visions of the church. On the one hand, there are those who would erase and deny tradition in the name of unconditional openness and assimilation to the world and its criteria of judgment. On the other, there are those who consider tradition something crystallized and mummified, removed from any fruitful historical process. And there ends Cardinal Sarah. My own wish and my hope in this Jubilee year of hope is that Leo will lead us quickly away from a toxic situation in which Catholics feel obliged to second-guess the words and decisions of the successor of Peter, but rather will find ourselves sustained, confirmed, challenged, and strengthened. What, after all, is the ultimate meaning of Leo's episcopal motto, if not a message of the unifying power of faith in Jesus? In illo uno unum. Thank you.
So I really love PowerPoint, so forgive me, and I certainly don't have the first-hand view of what's happening with Pope Leo that we heard from Tom. Thank you, Tom, for sharing that. Very thoughtful, thought-provoking. And Father Monsignor John Paul, such a pleasure to be with you this morning and to celebrate your elevation to the office. So I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to really look at some of the connections that I think are very evident between Leo XIII and Leo XIV in the tradition of social justice. So are my slides up? And then a couple of reflections on on his apostolic exhortation that Tom referred to. And forgive me for butchering the Latin. I dropped out of Latin like after 2 years in high school. So, and then I want to talk about the tradition of social justice in the Black Church. So I must say that I'm here representing the Seymour Institute for Black Church and Policy Studies. The founder and director has asked me not to name him, but I have got to acknowledge his leadership in all that we do in the Seymour Institute, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here representing the Seymour Institute. So I renamed my talk a little bit, as you may notice. The social justice tradition. Leo XIV, his namesake, and the Black Church. So Tom shared this earlier in his talk, where Pope Leo explains why he took the name Leo. That he's really focusing on Leo XIII and his historic encyclical Rerum Novarum, which addressed the social question in the context of the first industrial revolution. And Rerum Novarum, which was published in 1891, was a cornerstone, is the cornerstone of Catholic social teaching. It's the first encyclical on the topic. And it focuses on the needs of the working class at a time when the Industrial Revolution was driving people from the countryside into the cities. They were living in terrible conditions, in slums. They were working under inhumane conditions. And Pope Leo XIII spoke out. He denounced socialism, rejecting the idea that there should be no private property, but at the same time, he critiqued unchecked capitalism. And the guiding principles in Rerum Novarum were that workers had the right to organize, that the state ought to protect the interests of all groups, but not there should be no incursion on individual rights, such as the holding of private property. And at the same time, the church had a responsibility to engage with these kind of social problems, to propose solutions, and practice charity. His recommendations in that encyclical were that employers should pay just wages, that there should be a fair wage for a fair day's work, so there should be limits on the number of hours worked, there should be safe and humane working conditions, in particular limiting what women and children, it was not then illegal for children to be working, but limiting the kind of tasks that they would be called upon to do, and that workers should be allowed to unionize, and that not only the church should be providing charity, but also wealthy people in the society. Moving then to Leo XIV, he went on to say, the second part of that quote that I showed at the beginning, in our own day, the church offers to everyone the treasury of her social teaching, which developed based on Rerum Novarum, in response to another industrial revolution, which we are undergoing right now, and to developments in the field of artificial intelligence that pose new challenges for the defense of human dignity, justice, and labor. So Dilexite is the very first major statement from the Pope. It is an apostolic exhortation, and as Tom said, it really builds on the work of Pope Francis, who had himself drafted this, but also issued an encyclical, Dilexite Nos. But Leo in Dilexite says, I'm making this my own. And this is his first major statement, so I think that it is a good indication of his intention regarding his papacy. But I'm from the outside. I'm not a Catholic. I'm a Pentecostal. So I'm finding this all quite interesting, but I certainly don't have the front row seat that Tom has. He says that the purpose of this apostolic exhortation is to recall the age-old history of the church's care for the poor and with the poor in order to make clear that it has always been a central part of her life. It was interesting for me to hear from Tom that not everyone sees this as being consistent with Leo XIV. This seems to me very consistent with the quick summary I just gave of Rerum Novarum. The focus on the needs of the poor and the call to actually respond. So I want to give you a quick summary. I hope it'll be really quick, because I know that Monsignor is over there watching my time. Okay, thank you. So he starts out saying that he points to the fact that we're in this rising period of inequality, and that we as the church need to be responding to the cry of the poor because God hears their cry, and that more than that, that a focus on the poor can be a source of renewal for the church itself. He points out that God has chosen the poor, or as the Catholics would say, there's a preferential option for the poor. Christ identifies with the poor in a radical way, and I found this very moving in the bishop's presentation last night, Bishop Bishop Flores. Such a powerful, moving statement about how radically Christ presents himself as poor. And Leo goes on to say that he shares in the ultimate form of poverty, death. I might say, actually, the ultimate form of poverty is becoming human. He didn't grasp equality with God as something to be grasped, but he emptied himself, taking the very form of a servant, being born in the shape of a human. That's the ultimate poverty, that God becomes human. But I will go with death. That's pretty dramatic. The church, he says, to be true to Christ must embrace and serve the poor, and he points to Jesus' insistence that one cannot love God without extending one's love to the poor. The church ought to be a church of the poor, recognizing in those who are poor and who suffer the likeness of its poor and suffering founder. A little later, I'm going to come back to this and take some issue with this. The poor are the sacramental presence of the Lord, and caring for the poor is an expression of faith. And he has a long list of the tradition of the Catholic Church, caring for the poor, caring for the sick, caring for the poor in monasteries where they found refuge and where they were taught practical skills, in freeing prisoners, so that freedom is not simply spiritual, but also actually physical and concrete. In mendicant orders, brothers and sisters who renounced all poverty to truly become and live with the poor. In the education of people, even in periods when that was extraordinary for those who were not wealthy to be educated. In care for migrants, which continues even today. And in chapter 4, he points out that this is a history that continues, that there's been a century now of social doctrine, and that it's re-emphasized across the century, this focus on the poor, through the Second Vatican Council, encyclicals following the same trajectory, all saying that there must be an end to the growing inequality that comes from the acceptance of unchecked market forces, which is what we're up against today, right? Unchecked market forces. Well, that's a little dramatic. I mean, we're not back in the industrial age, but there is increasing deregulation. He says we can't accept an approach that normalizes sacrifices among the poor to enrich the wealthy, and we must see relief efforts as temporary fixes and focus on resolving structural causes. We must go beyond charity to actually having laws which are just and which protect the poor. And I quote, "The people of God have a duty to make their voices heard, to point out and denounce such structural issues." He also points out to the agency and autonomy of the poor, that they should have the right to worship in a way that's consistent with their own culture, and that they shouldn't simply be seen as objects of charity, but as subjects with power to drive their own lives. I thought that this was such a remarkable statement that I wanted to pull it out. It's actually a quotation from the Second Vatican Ecumenical Council, their pastoral constitutional Gaudium et Spes, forgive me again for butchering the Latin. Everyone has the right to possess a sufficient amount of the earth's goods for themselves and their family. Persons in extreme necessity are entitled to take what they need from the riches of others. I know he rejects socialism, but this is a pretty dramatic statement. Yet if you think about it, it's consistent with the Mosaic Law. Because the Mosaic Law said if you were hungry, you could walk into anybody's field. You couldn't reap their grain, but you could pluck it and eat it. And Christ and his disciples actually did that. People who owned land were injunctioned against going, once they had reaped anything that fell on the ground, they couldn't go back and pick it up. It had to be left for the poor, for widows, even for animals to eat. So this notion, which is so foreign to our society, that if you're in desperate need, you have the right to help yourself to someone else's private property, is very biblical. And I thought striking not only that it was in the Second Vatican Council, but also that Leo repeats it here. Chapter 5, he points out this is a constant challenge, the care of the poor. And it's a constant in history and in the future of the church. Jesus says the poor we will have with us always. It's a call, though, an invitation to everyone. It's not as though anybody has the right to say, I am not responsible. And that we must engage fully with the poor as full human beings, not simply throwing a dollar as we walk past. And our view tends to treat the poor as a public nuisance. I really found this convicting. I'm going to come back and talk about that a little more too. And he points to the example of the Good Samaritan, how dramatic his support for the poor was. And here I take a little issue. The poor are not responsible for their plight. I think that's very true, that they're real structural drivers, but I think it's complicated. I think that there is also individual responsibility, and that I don't hear much of that balance. An interesting idea that the poor can care for the rich because they confront us with our own responsibility to love and provide for them. That they give us the opportunity to be more like Christ, to let that word that Bishop Flores talked about, enter into us. And so the church has always been in solidarity with the outcast by her very nature, and the most important service to the poor is spiritual care. I like that, but again, I have some questions about that. Almsgiving today, he says, it's important, the most important thing is to help the poor find work, which again seems consistent with Leo XIII, to reinforce their dignity, because so much dignity is found in work, and to participate in the ongoing creative work of God, for them and us to do that. Charity will still be necessary, but it doesn't absolve governments of their responsibilities and our responsibility to hold governments responsible, and our acts of charity will reinforce our commitment to following Christ in his love for the poor. I found it a moving, challenging statement. I want to give you a couple of examples. How am I doing for time? 10 minutes. Oh, okay. So I'm going to move through these quickly. We're asked to devote, I have about 3 quotes, I'm only going to read one. We're asked to devote time to the poor, to give them loving attention, to listen to them with interest, to stand by them in difficult moments, choosing to spend hours, weeks, or even years of our lives with them, as the Pope did himself in South America, and striving to transform their situations, starting from them, because they have agency and autonomy and dignity. We cannot forget that this is what Jesus himself proposed in his actions and by his words. I really find that convicting, because when I walk past the poor, people begging on the streets, most I'm just trying to avoid them. And Leo convicts me that I ought not to be like the rich man who stepped over Lazarus, who lay at his door, the story that Jesus tells in the Gospels. It takes courage to really engage with the poor. It takes courage and it takes real empathy. And I really found this challenging in Leo's, in this apostolic exhortation. I found it a real exhortation. There were many others, but in the interest of time, I won't read all of them. If you'd like me to back up, you can ask in questions. But I do have a critical perspective on it as well. Jesus is the conquering Lion of Judah. Jesus is the risen and mighty Savior. He overcomes sin and death. Jesus rebuked the Pharisees. He overturned the tables in the temple. He drove people out, the money changers. He formed a whip. He shaped a whip to whip them out of it. He comes to execute judgment at the apocalypse. That Jesus is absent from this exhortation. And so as much as I love what he said, I feel that there is, and he can be excused, for saying I'm not writing about that aspect of Jesus right now, but it just struck me that it was missing. And I also felt that there was a tendency in this encyclical and in the recitation of Catholic social teaching, with which I am not extremely familiar, I'm an outsider, but it seems as though the poor are romanticized. Now, I can't believe that for Pope Leo, because he lived among them for many years. Yet in this writing, I feel they're kind of romanticized. And he quoted Pope St. Gregory the Great, "Whenever you see the poor doing something reprehensible, do not despise or discredit them, for the fire of poverty is perhaps purifying their sinful actions, however slight they be." That strikes me as not biblical. Because according to Leviticus 19:15, do not pervert justice, do not show partiality to the poor. Not just do not show partiality to the rich, but don't show it to the poor either, or favoritism to the great. And so I think we have to hold, if we believe that the poor have agency and dignity, we have to hold them accountable. And we have to share the gospel with them. We cannot assume, and this was another thing which I don't think I have any quotations to show this, but there is almost an assumption like the poor is the very flesh of the church. Does that mean they don't need Jesus? Does that mean they don't need to know that he died for their sins? I live among the poor, not as Leo has, but I live among the poor, and let me tell you, there's a lot of funk there. There's a lot of funk with me, but there's a lot of funk with them too. they're not so pure. We need to love them enough to share the gospel, and that doesn't come through either in this exhortation. So I want to give you a view from the bottom as I see it, because what I'm going to do here, we don't have any major encyclicals in the Black Church. We do have some important written documents, but the most important thing we have is a record of action. And I want to share that with you, and I'll try to go quickly. How am I doing?
6 minutes.
6 minutes, okay. So I wanted to just point out that the Black Church is the poor, has been the poor, and probably will be the poor, just given our position here in the United States. The Catholic Church is wealthy and powerful, and that was true when all of this social doctrine was being developed. Well, the Church of God in Christ, which is my husband's denomination and represents the largest Pentecostal wing of the Black Church here in the US, 70% of the members earn less than $50,000 per annum. That's pretty poor. Less than $50,000 per annum. Catholics are average for the country. 55%, only 55% of them earn less than $50,000 per annum. And the Catholic Church is wealthy. You've been to Rome, you've seen it, Liz. They have there's a whole Vatican museum, a lot of nice stuff. In fact, we were just talking with a friend yesterday. He's going to Boston to help the diocese there invest its very, or manage its very lucrative land holdings. Not so much in the Black Church. We don't have that kind of money. So to me, this is kind of a view from the bottom, but I'm going to move quickly. So we embrace Catholic Christian theology. I could say more, but I won't in the interest of time. But the Black Church starts from what was called a hidden institution, slave religion, and it was revolutionary, but it was also complicated. Just as I've tried to suggest that this Catholic social teaching is complicated, so is the Black history of social justice. That there was courage born of faith which drove people to escape from slavery and led to things like the rebellions led by Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner. There was courage to rebel against, to deny a master's command that opposed God, but it was also accommodationist. And by that I meant you could have pie in the sky, you know? You could say, well, I can put up with this here and now, whatever injustice I'm suffering, however wrong this is, because one day I will be in heaven with Jesus. So there's this tension, right? I don't want to suggest that it's all so simple. But even more important, it provided an independent worldview. Remember, slavery was a totalitarian experience, which meant that masters tried to control every thought, every movement, every action, every moment of a slave's life. But if you had a higher master, if you worshiped Jesus, you had a whole new vista that opened up to you. And you could see that God also held this same man who claimed to be your master, held him accountable. Moving fast, forgive me for not going through all the many bullets. I got carried away. I won't talk about Nat Turner. Maybe I'll just use this quote. Nat Turner, who led this rebellion, 1831, rejected the very idea of slave owners and the institution of slavery. For Turner, and he was a devout, I'm skipping that, but he really was a devout Christian. For Turner, blacks were not meant to be enslaved in America. Therefore, Turner sought to free himself and all black slaves from the despair and degradation inherent in the condition of bondage. Fueled, motivated by his faith. That's the kind of social justice that you see in the Black Church, not so much in encyclicals. Bishop Richard Allen was a founding bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He was a devout Christian, a former slave. And he fought for the abolition of slavery. So his position on social justice was one of action. He wrote and distributed this anti-slavery pamphlet in a time when slavery was still very much, this was end of the 19th century. No, I'm sorry. End of the 18th century, and he had a key role in organizing black aid workers during yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia in the 1790s. They helped whites. When other people were fleeing the city, blacks stayed behind and took care of sick white people at the risk of their own lives because they were not immune to yellow fever. And they built support for abolition of slavery. Black liberation theology, I'm really going to go fast here. So this one is not so much about action, this is more about the thought of James Cone. And he picks up the same themes that you see in Catholic social teaching, that Jesus is essentially connected to liberation. Remember, one of the things that de L'Excité talks about is a tradition of freeing prisoners in the Catholic Church, recognizing that Jesus comes not just to free us spiritually, but also in the here and now. And he picks up another theme that's in de L'Excité. Jesus identifies with the poor by his birth, the radical act of emptying himself of some aspects of his godhood to become a human being. But Cone, unlike de L'Excité, still focuses on justice through his lordship, but also identifies Jesus as the healer. But I think Cone goes overboard too. It's all complicated, right? Nobody has it perfectly right. Because he talks about the poor fighting against injustice as the gospel. That's not the gospel. The gospel is that Jesus died, rose from the dead, paid the price of our sin on the cross. So Cone goes overboard in the opposite direction, claiming that the fight against social injustice is the gospel. And he goes as far as to say, and this was very controversial when he wrote this in the 60s, that Jesus is black. He always identifies with the oppressed, and to do that in the US today is to be black. Well, there are lots of oppressed people in the US, not just black people. So would he identify with black people? Yes. But solely with black people? No. On the other hand, should white people present Jesus? I grew up in Jamaica, and my grandmother had on her wall the picture of Jesus. And did he look like her? No. Did he look like me? No. He looked like a white man. Well, actually, he was Middle Eastern. He shouldn't look like a white man. So is it right for white people to make him white? No. So Cone is kind of pushing back against an existing problem in theology of his time. You see, there was lots here that I decided, no, let's, okay. Okay, I'm at time. Can I have 2 minutes?
Yeah, it's fine.
You're so kind. All right. Black Baptist
I know
women.
better than to say no.
Monsignor, I have to bow to you. So Evelyn Higginbotham writes about Black Baptist women and their work in what was called the Nadir, which was a period of a terrible period in the history of Black America when 3 people were being lynched every week and 70% of them were black. And in the following years, so that was like at the turn of the century, end of the 19th century, early in the 20th century, the numbers fell, but now 90% of those being lynched were black. That's what's called the nadir among black people. And at that point, black women are essential in building the Black Baptist Church. And they are raising funds for schools, they're organizing welfare services, and they're combining not just an attention to racial equality, but also gender equality. They're lobbying for anti-lynching legislation, working with white Baptist women on those issues, and on ending legal segregation. And they're also, at the same time, in their own church, advocating for the rights of women and asserting their right to be a part of the church leadership. So the church unified the voice of the masses, black masses, against white domination. The women were key in rallying the black poor to resist white control. They opposed lynching, and they worked with white Baptist women on anti-lynching legislation. They demanded broad structural changes. That was one of the things that I really liked running through the Lexité, the focus on structural changes, saying it's not just enough for us to do charity works or even to live with the poor, that we need to be working for laws that will be more just. The same thing happened here with these Black Baptist women. And they ultimately rejected the separate but equal logic that was in Jim Crow and organized protests. Their strategies were to mobilize fasting and prayer as tools of protest, critique Woodrow Wilson, the then president, on race, and to advocate for the church to teach voter education. Oops. I'm not quite sure what happened. I just want to say the civil rights movement was also an exercise in social justice with multiple protest actions, lunch counter sit-ins, freedom rides, a whole campaign, not just in Birmingham, but in other cities. And that in addition to the work of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference led by Martin Luther King, there was also the work of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who organized Mississippi Freedom Summer and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, of which probably most of you have never heard, and challenged the white supremacist delegation to the Democratic National Convention. It was all white. This is the Democrats, all white, their delegation from Mississippi, entirely racist. And part of the civil rights movement was to challenge that. And their accomplishments, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, an end to the reign of terror in the South. I know that right now the Voting Rights Act is under assault, but the atmosphere in the South, the atmosphere of fear in a period when lynching was so common and so many of the victims were Black, that has been transformed. An end to segregation in public accommodations. They also opposed the Vietnam War, established the Poor People's Campaign, and all of this, the motivation was because they were devout Christians. According to one historian, David Chappelle, what makes the civil rights movement matter is the prophetic ideas that it embodies. And today we continue to provide social services. One study in Philadelphia found that the Black church, Black congregations provide roughly $90 million in uncompensated services annually. And that was in the early 2000s, 20 years ago. It would be worth a lot more now. And the conclusion of the authors of that study, one can only imagine how our urban scene would look if these Black congregations ceased to be providers of care. If such a scenario were to occur, the burden on public services and the social unrest that would follow are hard to imagine. So the Black church continues to be a source of social justice. Thank you.
As I warned you, and not even warned you, as I provided you insight ahead of time, you two very gifted speakers, two very knowledgeable contributors to our conversation today. And I will, because I can't not do it, because I love both of these people and I love listening to them talk and to have conversations with them. One of the things that you both mentioned, I'll take the moderator's privilege and pose the first question, starting from a couple of presuppositions that both of you mentioned, that tradition is not crystallized. Dr. Rivers reminded all of us that Jesus is not nearly as soft as he often comes across in Catholic teaching, that the Jesus of the scriptures is complicated, like so much of what Dr. Rivers reminded us. But Leo XIII, again, is most well identified with Rerum Novarum. And of course, this means, on new things. And we are certainly facing a time right now where there is this res nova, there is this new thing. And I don't want to limit it to just a conversation about artificial intelligence, but more importantly, these new forms of poverty that I think Delicité talks about and hints at. So I wonder if both of you could speak about these new forms of poverty in light of, in light of Leo's pontificate, and what we could do potentially as believers, as men and women of faith, to unite in a new form of social justice to approach these new forms of poverty that we're facing.
I'll throw one out there. This is perhaps not the most important, but it's one that I face and my wife faces constantly, teaching third-year undergraduate college students, which is a growing loss of the ability of critical thinking and of basic intellectual formation. And it's going to be a form of poverty where people really do lose their agency because they will have to rely on what other people tell them because they no longer know how to reason through arguments, to push back. They don't even have enough information sometimes to know what questions to ask their cell phones. And that's very scary. For me, that's very scary. And doing this constantly, year by year, you actually see the trend. And that will lead to many other forms of poverty, but that will be the root of what is causing that.
I have to agree with that. I attended a panel at Harvard recently, and one of the researchers from MIT talked about the fact that radiologists, they did a study, radiologists were using ChatGPT to help them read radiologic images, and it did improve their performance, but that within just 3 months, their skills had begun to atrophy. Just 3 months. And so I think it's really important. I immediately got in touch with my sister, who, though she's in her 70s, likes to use ChatGPT, and I was like, you know what you're doing to yourself? So I don't think, on the other hand, I just saw a headline talking about, power users of AI are getting ahead on the job. Now, is it they who are getting ahead, or is it AI that's getting ahead? That part wasn't so clear. I'm not suggesting we need to disengage entirely, but I really think we have to be very mindful and careful about how we use artificial intelligence because it promises to render us brainless. And I think that that is a place for us to organize because young people need to understand that college professors who are calling them not to use AI to write their papers are doing it in their interest, are doing it to defend the college students themselves. But I think we also have to, there's a book by Paul Northside. I'm sorry, blanking. Yeah, it's a book. It's
Paul Kingsnorth. Resist the Machine.
Resist the Machine. Resist the Machine. And I think we have to, first of all, educate ourselves. That's the most important thing. And then figure out how we work with like-minded people to try and put some checks. There's also a book by Jeremy Kahn, Mastering AI. How do we put checks? How do we call on our government, especially in this divided time, to put checks on what companies creating AI are allowed to do, how it's allowed into the workplace? Jeremy Kahn has a number of very good suggestions. And I think to get the power of the church behind movements like this, especially the new Pope, would be very powerful.
I think, again, just to make that last connection, that so much of social justice in both traditions is based on the notion of agency, because agency is the reflection of our dignity. Those are the gifts of God, is our dignity, which we exercise through our agency. And the fact that we're facing this new thing that tends to impoverish our agency, I think that's a call to action for all of those who work in social justice, Christian or not.
Absolutely.
I just want to super fast, because we were at the same conference a couple of weeks ago, and one fellow put forward a very, very interesting analogy. He said in the 1980s, Americans in particular, but all over the West and other parts of the world a little bit less, people started realizing they were getting fat. And there was a huge running craze, and gyms they were everywhere, and people just started saying, we're going to take this back because naturally we're not working on farms anymore, we're not lifting things, we're not carrying things, we're not walking to places we're driving, we're all getting fat, we have to do something about this. And he said, the fellow who put this forward said, in an age where you don't need your mind as much as you did, you don't need to remember things as much as you did, we're going to need gyms for our minds and for our souls as this work is taken over by others. And we need to have that same kind of pushback where we have an ability to keep challenging our minds, working our minds, so that they are as active and as powerful as before.
But that also says how difficult it would be, because we all know that the obesity epidemic has not been solved. Sure. So this is not a small challenge. But I think the other question about agency is, I talked about the gospel being the death and resurrection of Jesus, but it's up to us to recognize our need for him and to appropriate that gift. But if we can't think, can we even recognize our sin? I mean, it's really profound. This is not just about turning into a couch potato and not being able to, I guess you can make a living because AI is going to think for you, but your eternal soul may be at risk here.
Exactly. So we have a little time for questions. Just a reminder that the session is being recorded, so please wait for the microphone. And if you would, just mindful, keep your questions as brief as possible. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for your talks. They're both so related, yet such wonderful, diverse perspectives. I just have a question, mostly for Dr. Rivers, but of course, if you have anything to put, which I'm sure you have something very insightful. So I was wondering, and I think that the conversation about AI plays into this in an interesting way. How can we balance the idea that we all need to be charitable, but we can't just let the systems that we put in do it for us? And I think that it seems like a lot of systems that are being put into place are trying to do the things that we just as an individual human should be doing, like feeding the poor, things like that. And I think what you said about AI and the neurologists, how just after 3 months of having something else do what they normally do for them, they stopped being able to do it. Is that happening to us in being charitable? If these government systems using tax dollars that, yes, they're coming from us, but we don't affirm and choose to give it to them for that necessarily. Is that taking away our ability to be charitable? And how can we balance that?
Well, I think it's a good question because we have to practice charity. There are lots of ways to practice charity, though, which don't necessarily have to do with there being people on the streets begging. We can practice charity in our daily interactions with people around us. But I think you also give government way too much credit. I don't think they're ever going to solve the problem of poverty. And I think the scale on which the problem of inequality exists in the United States, we cannot assume that we as individuals or even the church can bear the load. So, for example, with the loss of SNAP benefits during the government shutdown, a lot of churches, a lot of individuals, a lot of food pantries tried to step up, but the actual fact was it simply was too big a task for them. So I think and I think even in the role of government, we have a role there, right? Because it is up to us to put the pressure on government to put in place policies that will both assist the poor and work against poverty. Look, the whole Mosaic Law was designed to work against poverty, to return land to people in the Jubilee, so that you would not have permanent dependency, right? So it's our, and again, the focus in Catholic social teaching, and I think in the Black church, on teach a man to fish, don't just give him a fish. But we have the responsibility to monitor our government and make sure that policies are put in place that are equipping people to rise out of poverty. And there'll still be lots of people for us to give to, no matter how well they do it, because they're just never going to solve the problem.
That's great.
Okay. Ed, do you want to?
Thank you all for your very, very enjoyable talks. Something that occurred to me as you were speaking was that a difference between Leo XIII and Rerum Novarum and Leo XIV and whatever we get in the shape of his own Rerum Novarum we'll all be able to read the new Rerum Novarum immediately and for ourselves. And the original Rerum Novarum would have had to pass through 6, 7, 8 pairs of hands before sort of person in the pews would get their sense of it. And I'm curious how you think that transition to immediate mass communication from the center to use a loaded phrase from the Franciscaries, the peripheries, how that affects a communion of persons. You know, the theme is living tradition, and tradition is something that's physically handed on from one person to another. Do you see a risk where if everyone can be in sort of immediate intellectual communion with the center, it atomizes. It cuts out a human chain that actually is essential for church communion.
I think it can have the opposite effect too, though. I think that that's one possibility, but I think it can also really unify us, because there's a sense in which we can have ownership and in the message that comes from the center, a sense in which we can share the burden of whatever responsibility is being assigned to us. And I think but I do think atomization is really a problem, so I don't want to downplay that. But I think the other thing is that it also does a lot to guarantee the fidelity of the message. So you don't have telephone, right? I heard him say this, and I told you, and you heard, and you know, that the message changes as it goes from hand to hand. So I think they're both upsides and downsides.
I think it's a great question. I think there are two, historically, there's many things, but one would be the printing press and one would be the Second Vatican Council in very different ways. The Second Vatican Council very famously did not reach the people. The documents and the deliberations of the council did not immediately wind up in the hands of the faithful. The faithful got a very filtered version through the media of that time, which left a lot of people totally misunderstanding what Vatican II was about, because they did not have immediate contact with the text and what the actual, and so there was a distortion. It was a distortion because there was this group of people that were able to control the message. And having those texts immediately in your hands gives you the ability to say, well, no, that's not what that is. That's not what that is. So that's on the one hand, the benefit of having direct access. There were obviously many, many debates over the century, especially with the printing press, about putting the hands of the Word of God into putting the Word of God into the hands of the faithful, with the great fear of atomization. And you could say, and I think that despite our different traditions, you could say the fact that we have tens of thousands of denominations might suggest that atomization occurs even at an ecclesial level, where everyone interprets that word in a different way. You don't get it as something that is curated by a pastor or by a teaching authority that actually helps to decipher and to put things into context, etc. So, but it's good. And obviously, the Catholic Church, I think, struggled with that more than other institutions, ultimately fully embraced the idea that every Catholic should have direct contact with the Word of God. But it doesn't eliminate the need for that other teaching role, and that, you know, people able to mentor those who are in contact with that Word.
Time for two more questions, perhaps. You had your hand up front. I'm sorry? And then, so we'll start in the back and then one up front.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you both. My question's for Tom. So earlier this week, the papal nuncio told the American bishops that the way forward was to be in continuity with Francis. And so my question is not about the specifics about that, but about, do you have hope in this Jubilee of Hope that we may see a course correction on centering church authority, the understanding of what it means to be church, what it means to be Catholic, on this kind of hyper-papalist personality of the Pope or the agenda of a specific Pope, and see it more recentered in tradition?
Well, many have already put forward the idea that Francis has done more than any recent Pope to, in a way, push back against ultramontanism, even though there is a small group of those who say every word that comes out of his mouth must be, you know, treasured and kept in a golden box. But others who say, well, isn't this, you know, he's just the same right now that he has passed as Gregory the 16th or as Innocent the 11th. I mean, we can take those and we go back and we find they're all part of that magisterium and that tradition, but we don't give a special weight because someone was more recent than another. That chronological effect is just irrelevant for Catholics. It's completely irrelevant. And I think what Leo, and this has been recognized by people more tending right or left, have recognized in Leo that a real desire to recenter on Christ and recenter on the message of the gospel. He's tending away from, he doesn't deny the important political and social questions, but he speaks a lot about Jesus. And it seems to me that theological unity is, in the end, the source of all the rest of the unity. When you can get people back focused on what we actually believe in who is our Savior, And it's not Francis, and it's not Paul VI, and it's not John Paul II. Our Savior's Jesus. And refocusing that attention is ultimately what will lead us both to a proper reaction against ultramontanism, and also to a real reunification of the church itself.
So, Sister, I'm sorry you had your hand up, and we'll do the last question. So.
Thank you. My question is, I heard a priest, or actually several priests, say that the next scandal in the church will be a financial one. Would love to hear your comments on that.
Way above my pay grade.
I don't think so. There have been financial scandals in the church. Let's go back, I think, to the Marcinkus years in the 1980s, huge financial scandals. But people only react to that for a short while. It just doesn't have the same kind of hold in people's hearts. You can see that, and you also realize that it's at the level of individuals. You can point to them and see what was done, and there's general agreement that should not happen. And there has been, if we talk about the Vatican itself, a real effort at reform. There's still a lot more. We have Ed Condon here, who happens to be the world's expert on Vatican financial reform. And he could step forward and lecture you for a very long time about what has been done, what has not been done, what needs to be done, et cetera, and you would get a very good understanding of this. But the fact of the matter is, I don't believe that will ever be the sort of scandal that rocks the church in such a way that people are like, oh my gosh, the scandals about financial questions are more like the ones that Jackie was talking about earlier, when people go and they are told that the Vatican has great stores of gold beneath it, and they're from kind of the past, this idea of this extraordinarily rich church. And while obviously there's enormous amounts of land ownings and art ownings and other things, the church exists everywhere. Peru, where the Pope was until very recently working, is an extraordinarily poor country, and the church there has what the people have. They don't have gold buildings, they don't have marble buildings. They live in and amongst the poor, and the church is poor there because it's a poor country. And the church kind of follows what the reality is around it. No, I don't particularly see that as being a major issue.
And Sister, I'll just add this. I think one of the things that's very important to remember about the question of scandal in religious communities in general, so not only the Catholic Church, but all religious communities, is faith and culture interact. And there are different bright lines in different cultures. So it's very clear that in Western culture, we have put a bright line around certain sexual offenses. And we say that whatever that is, that's a no-fly zone. Financial offenses, maybe. And then there are other cultures that are completely different, where financial offenses are the gravest and sexual offenses we'll see. So there's a cultural element there that I think will prevent any single scandal from rocking any single religious community, because the Church of Christ exists everywhere, all the time. And I think he himself is our saving grace from our own failings. I'm sorry, so last question, I apologize.
Hello, my name is Matea Watson. I'm a junior over at Holy Cross College. Thank you guys both so much, as well as you for leading the conversation. And so mine is directed towards Dr. Rivers. So in an article I've read recently by Mr. Sam Wells, he's mentioned 4 modes of interacting with the poor, one being working for, working with, being for, and being with. And so those are all basically different ways of interacting. One is kind of giving the man the fish versus teaching him how to fish, walking with him, and then just sitting with him as he's fishing, I suppose. And so in part of your presentation, I noticed, I might be misquoting you, but to identify with the oppressed is to identify, I don't know if you said with the Black community, but something along those lines. And so I was wondering what your recommendation would be to us in the room, as well as in general, for kind of having those latter 3 modes of working with, kind of helping the man fish on his own, lest we kind of stoke our own superiority complex or impose a victim mentality on those that we're trying to help.
I think that's a good question. I think in working with the poor, it's very easy to be condescending and judgmental. And I think that is part of the challenge of Dilexite and of the tradition of the Black church, to really humble ourselves and recognize, to see the poor as our equals, and to recognize the gift that's suggested, that actually this is an opportunity for us, that they present an opportunity and gift to us in being more like Christ, and in, as Bishop Fuentes said, opening up just a crack to allow the word of God to come into us and his love to be poured out through us. So I think that, and I think it's important for us to think about this question of mindset and what are we doing, and not just to plunge into, here's some money and let me fix the laws. But I think we have to do all of it. Does that make sense? So we have to be thinking about why we're doing it, what it means, how we're approaching people, the fact that we're approaching human beings who are our equal, and then how do we put our shoulder to the wheel to lighten their load? So I don't think it's an either or. I think all of those things have to be done. Does that help?
The Black community does need to grow in, but also using the word oppressed can inflict a certain mentality onto those that we're working with.
So I think that the question about victim mentality is loaded. The truth is that Black people have been oppressed in this country. The stats I gave from the Nadir, I think, point out that it extended well beyond slavery. I don't know anyone, certainly not James Cone, who I was citing there, who says that means we ought to just sit down and die. I think Black people feel we need to fight back. We need to take responsibility. And that's part of my critique of Dilexity, right? That they poor, even though we say they have agency, at the same time they're treated as, they're romanticized, I think. So it has to be that we recognize the oppression, but that we don't simply slump into victimhood, that we say, okay, we're oppressed and we all still have agency. We're oppressed and we're going to work hard, despite the obstacles and the structural barriers that still exist. We are still going to take responsibility for ourselves, our families, for our future. Make sense?
So ladies and gentlemen, as you can hear from the noise around us, our time is up. But again, I want you to please thank Dr. Rivers and Dr. Williams